The first time Jennie Slater raised her voice in the town of Dust Creek, New Mexico Territory, every man within earshot took a step backward. Every man, that is, except one. The year was 1878, and Dust Creek sat baking under a merciless August sun, crouched between Red Canyon walls and flat scrubland that stretched so far a person could lose their sense of self just looking at it. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, but large enough that the business was always complicated. There was a general store run by a man named Harlow who kept his thumb on the scale, a saloon called the Copper Nail that smelled of sawdust and regret, a livery stable, a sheriff's office that sat conspicuously quiet most days, and a church whose congregation shrank every time a new preacher arrived and discovered what kind of place he'd actually come to. Jennie Slater had arrived in Dust Creek 18 months before the August in question, trailing a past she didn't discuss, and carrying a leather saddlebag that clinked with tools instead of coins. She was 24 years old, brown-haired, straight-backed, and possessed of eyes the color of strong coffee that had a way of making a person feel seen clear through. She had apprenticed under her father back in Missouri, learning the blacksmith trade from the time she was old enough to hold a hammer steady, and when her father had died of pneumonia 2 winters back and left her nothing but debt and grief, she had packed what she could carry, sold what she couldn't, and ridden west on a mule she'd named Consequential. She had set up her smithy in a linta behind the livery, and she had made herself indispensable so quickly that by the time the men of Dust Creek figured out they had a woman shoeing their horses and mending their wagon wheel rims, they were already too dependent on her skill to say much about it. They grumbled, of course. Men always grumbled. But their horses were shod well, their tools came back sharper than before, and the price Jennie charged was fair without being apologetic. The August afternoon that changed everything began ordinarily enough. Jennie was at her forge, her leather apron dark with sweat, her hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades, when Silas Bright rode into town with 3 of his ranch hands behind him. Silas Bright owned the largest spread in the territory, a cattle operation called the Double B that employed roughly 40 men and occupied land that Silas claimed through a combination of legal deed, strategic marriage, and an absolute unwillingness to acknowledge any claim but his own. He was 51 years old, wide as a barrel, and accustomed to getting his way before he'd even finished asking for it. He wanted his 6 horses reshod, he wanted it done by sundown, and he wanted it done at half the price Jennie charged. He dismounted with the deliberate heaviness of a man who expects the ground to feel honored by his weight and announced this to Jennie without preamble. Jennie set down her hammer slowly. She wiped her hands on the leather of her apron. She looked at Silas Bright the way a person looks at a sum that doesn't add up. "The price is the price," she said, and her voice was even, the way still water is even before something moves beneath it. "Price changes for a man who brings 6 horses instead of 1, Silas said. "The price changes for volume orders that I've agreed to in advance," Jennie said. "We didn't agree to anything in advance." Silas's face did something complicated. The ranch hands behind him shifted in their saddles. The handful of townspeople who'd been going about their afternoon business had slowed or stopped entirely, the way people do when they sense something is about to happen that they'll want to describe later. "I don't negotiate with women," Silas said, and said it like he was doing her a kindness by explaining the rules. That was when Jennie Slater raised her voice. It was not a shriek, not a wail, not the kind of sound that anyone could have dismissed as feminine hysteria. It was the voice of someone who had swallowed too much dismissal and found the last of her patience had finally dissolved. It was clear and strong, and it carried across the dusty street without effort, and every word landed like a stone dropped from height. "You will pay what I charge, or you will take your horses and ride them on feet that haven't been properly seen to in 3 months, and when they go lame on the trail and you lose cattle because of it, you will have no one to blame but your own arrogance, Silas Bright, and every man in this town will know exactly why it happened." The silence that followed was the kind that is weight. Silas went red. His ranch hands to a man shifted backward in their saddles, creating small involuntary distances between themselves and the sound of a woman's anger. The bystanders near the general store had each taken a reflexive half-step away from the scene, the way people move from a fire that's gotten bigger than expected. All of them moved back, every one, except the man who had been standing at the water trough at the edge of the street, watering a tall dun horse with a patient, unhurried manner. He had his hat pushed back on his head and his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he had simply not moved. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't looked away. He had watched Jennie Slater with the calm attention of a man who finds something genuinely worth watching. His name was Cornelius Keller, and he was passing through. That was what he'd told the sheriff when he'd ridden in 2 days prior, and it was technically true in the sense that he had not yet decided to stay. He was 28 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spend most of their time outdoors tend to be weathered, not beaten by it, but shaped by it, the way stone is shaped by wind. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and gray eyes that were thoughtful more often than they were anything else. He'd ridden down from Colorado, following work mostly, doing some cattle driving for one outfit and then another, occasionally hiring out his carpentry skills when the cattle work dried up, and he had the particular self-possession of a man who has spent enough time alone to know exactly who he is. He had not stepped back. Silas Bright was too focused on Jennie to notice Cornelius right away. He was in the process of deciding how to respond to being dressed down in public by a woman half his size, and the calculus of his pride was taking some time. Eventually, he paid. He paid full price, handing over the coins with the performative reluctance of a man who wants everyone to know he's not beaten even when he is, and he told his ranch hands to leave the horses and come back at sunset. Then he walked to the copper nail without looking at Jennie again, which was its own kind of statement. The bystanders dispersed. The street resumed its usual business, and Jennie turned back to her forge and found herself facing the man who had not moved. He was not close. He was still at the water trough, his horse drinking with steady patience beside him. But he was looking at her, and there was something in the way he was looking that was not pity and not admiration exactly. It was something more complicated than either. It was recognition. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was quiet, not soft exactly. There was nothing timid about it, but it did not push. It simply arrived. "Afternoon," Jennie said, wary in the way she had learned to be wary of men who spoke to her after scenes like that one. They usually wanted to tell her she'd been brave, or tell her she'd been foolish, or tell her she'd made an enemy of Silas Bright, as though she hadn't already considered that herself. But Cornelius Keller did not say any of those things. He said, "That horse of yours at the end there, the roan, she's been favoring her left foreleg. I noticed when Bright's men rode in." Jennie blinked. Then she looked past him at the string of horses tied outside the livery. "She has a stone bruise," she said, after a moment of assessment. "I'll pad the shoe when I do her feet." "I thought it might be something like that," he said, and he nodded once, not in the way of a man who is congratulating himself for being right, but in the way of a man who is simply acknowledging that the world has confirmed what he suspected, and he finds that satisfying. Then he turned back to his horse and let it finish drinking. That was the whole conversation. Jennie thought about it that evening, sitting outside her lean-to in the cooling dark with a tin cup of coffee going cold in her hand. She thought about the way every other man had moved back and the way he had not. She thought about it the way you think about a sound you can't quite identify, not obsessively, not with any particular intention, just with the persistent awareness that something has happened and you haven't yet decided what it means. Cornelius Keller had not decided to stay in Dusk Creek when he rode in. He decided to stay on the third day, which was the day after Jennie Slater raised her voice at Silas Bright, and he did not step back. He told himself it was because he'd heard there might be some cattle driving work in the area come the fall, and that was true enough. The Double B was not the only outfit, and there was a smaller rancher named Deerfield who'd been building up his herd and would need hands for the autumn drive. That was a practical reason to stay, and Cornelius was a practical man. He took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Cathcart, who set out a reasonable breakfast and kept the linens clean and didn't ask too many questions, which were the three qualities Cornelius valued most in a landlady. He found small work to keep him occupied, some fencing for a homesteader named Vargas, some carpentry repairs at the church, and he settled into the rhythm of the town with the ease of a man who knows how to be useful without making himself conspicuous. He saw Jennie Slater most days. The town was small enough that not seeing someone required effort, and he made no such effort. He did not seek her out in any way that could be called obvious. He brought his horse, whose name was Fletcher, in for new shoes when the time came, and he paid the full price without comment, and he watched her work with the unhurried attention he gave to things he found impressive. She was efficient and sure-handed, and she did not perform her competence for anyone's benefit. She simply was competent, and she got on with it. "You're a carpenter as well?" she asked him one afternoon while she finished Fletcher's second shoe. She'd heard from Mrs. Cathcart, who'd heard from someone at the general store, that the church repairs were being done by the passing cowboy. "When it's needed," he said. He was standing at the edge of the lean-to the way he'd taken to doing when he brought his horse, not inside the workspace but not far from it. "My father had a furniture-making business back in Pennsylvania. I grew up with wood before I grew up with cattle." "Pennsylvania's a long way," she said. "It is," he agreed. She glanced up at him between strokes of the file she was running along Fletcher's hoof. "What brought you west?" There was a pause, not the uncomfortable kind, more the kind where a person is deciding how much truth to give. "The same thing that brings most people west," he said. "The idea that there's more room out here." "More room for what?" "For whatever you need room for," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the file. "That's a careful answer," she said. "It's an honest one," he said. She didn't argue with that. The thing about Dust Creek in the late 1870s was that it was a town in the process of making itself, the way a lot of New Mexico Territory towns were. The cattle trade had brought money, and money had brought more people, and more people had brought more complications. There was a real estate speculation going on in the territory that was bringing in outside money and outside men, and some of those men were the kind who treated the law as a suggestion rather than a rule. Silas Bright was not an outright criminal, but he operated in that territory between law and lawlessness that powerful men in remote places often occupied. He owned enough of the local commerce and employed enough of the local labor that the sheriff, a man named Purdy who was not corrupt exactly but was certainly afraid, tended to look the other way when the Double B's interests were involved. Jennie had been on the wrong side of Silas Bright's goodwill since about 6 months after she'd arrived in Dust Creek. She had refused to give him preferential pricing, which he'd considered an insult. She had then refused to allow 2 of his ranch hands to take their horses without paying first, which he'd considered insubordination. And she had then, in a moment she'd been both proud of and privately anxious about ever since, reported to Sheriff Purdy that one of the Double B riders had been using her smithy's well without permission and had broken the handle in the process and refused to replace it. Purdy had done nothing as she'd expected, but the complaint was on record. What she had not anticipated was that Silas would take it as a declaration of war. It started with small things. The alley behind her smithy was used as a through route to the main street, and it began to get blocked regularly by Double B horses tied without consideration. Her supply deliveries from the south started arriving late, and then sometimes not at all, and when she inquired she found that a man who matched the description of one of Bright's riders had been speaking to the supply wagon's driver in an unfriendly manner at the way station 12 miles out. One of her regular customers, a homesteader named Chalmers who'd been bringing her his plow repairs for a year, stopped coming, And when she saw him at the general store and asked after his business, he looked at the floor and said he'd been getting his metal work done elsewhere. And he said it with the tone of a man who has been frightened. She was sitting on the steps of her Linta one evening in late September, working through these problems with the particular fury of someone who is too tired to act on their fury right now, but is committing it carefully to memory, when Cornelius sat down on the fence post across from her. He had developed a habit, she had noticed, of appearing when she was sitting outside in the evenings, not seeking her out precisely, but not avoiding the coincidence either. They had fallen into the pattern of talking in the evenings, sometimes for only 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour, and she had come to value it more than she'd intended to. "Bright is squeezing you," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. "Word travels. I keep my ears open," he said. "He's been telling people your work has gotten careless. I heard it at the Copper Nail tonight." She felt the anger rise in her throat like heat from the forge. "My work has never been careless," she said. "No," he agreed simply. "It hasn't. You're defending my work to people at the saloon. I'm correcting a false statement when I hear one," he said. "There's a difference." A pause. "Fletcher's shoes haven't slipped once since you fit them, and that horse doesn't cooperate easily. People who know horses know that means something." She looked at him in the failing light. The evenings had started cooling in the past 2 weeks, and the sky above the canyon walls was going that deep, complicated blue that New Mexico Territory skies specialized in, layered with violet and fading gold at the horizon. "Why are you still here?" she asked, not rudely, genuinely. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Deerfield's drive isn't until mid-October," he said. And he stopped, and in the pause she heard something he was deciding how to say. "And I find I'm not in a particular hurry," he said finally. "Not in a hurry to go where?" "Anywhere," he said. She absorbed this. A night bird called out somewhere in the scrub beyond the edge of town, and the first stars were arriving in the east, small and definite. "I haven't had anyone defend my work at the saloon before," she said. "I'm not sure what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It wasn't done so you'd have to respond." She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her chest that she could not entirely account for and did not immediately examine. "I'm going to ride out to the Chalmers homestead tomorrow," she said. "I want to know what exactly was said to him." "I'd go with you if you'd let me," he said, "not to argue on your behalf. Just because 12 miles of scrubland on your own is 12 miles and there are riders who don't respect solitude." She wanted to refuse. She had built her independence here with careful, deliberate hands, and she was protective of it the way you're protective of something that cost you a great deal. But she was also, underneath the independence, a practical woman. "6 in the morning," she said. "I'm not waiting." "I'll be ready," he said. They rode out the next morning in the early light, when the air still had that thin cold edge to it, and the sky was the pale gold of fresh straw. Jennie rode Consequential, who had proven to be a steadier animal than his name suggested, and Cornelius rode Fletcher, and they covered the 12 miles to the Chalmers homestead in a companionable silence that neither of them felt the need to fill. Cornelius noticed things on the trail: a hawk circling something dead in the scrub, a set of boot prints in a dried creek bed that were recent and without a corresponding horse track, a section of fence wire along the edge of the bright range that had been freshly mended. And he noted them quietly without elaborating, the habit of a man who has learned to read the country he's moving through. Jennie found herself listening to these small observations with an interest that surprised her. Harold Chalmers was a thin, weathered man in his 40s with the permanently worried expression of a dry-land farmer who has made peace with uncertainty, but not yet with anxiety. He was in his yard when they arrived, mending a harness, and he watched them come with the wariness of someone who's been visited by the wrong kind of people recently. When Jennie told him why she'd come, he put down the harness and sat on the edge of his porch and said quietly that one of Bright's men had told him that Jennie Slater was in arrears to the Double B, that she'd borrowed money she hadn't paid back, and that any man who kept doing business with her would be seen as supporting that default. He said it with the manner of a man who doesn't believe what he's repeating but is nonetheless afraid of the person it came from. Jennie kept her voice very even. "That is a complete lie," she said. "I have never borrowed a cent from Silas Bright or anyone associated with him." "I thought it sounded wrong," Chalmers said unhappily. "But the man who told me, I know what kind of man he is," Jennie said. "Can you tell me who it was specifically?" Chalmers described him. A tall man with a scar across one eyebrow and a gray horse, and Cornelius, without interrupting, filed the description away. Riding back, the sun higher now and the scrubland warming to its working temperature, Jennie let the anger move through her like a current and then let it settle. She had learned, over years of being underestimated and talked over and maneuvered against, that raw anger was fuel, but undirected fuel was just fire, and fire without direction just burned things down. She needed to think. "He's trying to isolate your business," Cornelius said, as though he'd been following the same line of thought. "I know," she said. "If he cuts off enough of your customers, I know what happens then," she said, and there was a sharpness in it that wasn't aimed at him. She heard it herself. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "I'm not angry at you." "I know you're not," he said. He didn't sound bothered. She looked at him sideways. "You're very hard to rattle," she observed. "I've been told," he said. "Is that a quality you came by naturally or one you worked on?" Something moved in his expression that was almost a smile but had something else underneath it. "Probably some of each," he said. "My mother was a woman who said exactly what she thought, and she didn't have much patience for people who couldn't take straight speech. I learned early that the way people talk when they're feeling something strongly is usually the most honest they'll ever be." Jennie was quiet for a moment. The scrubland rolled past them, dry and tawny, punctuated by juniper and ocotillo. "Most people in this town think I'm," she started and then stopped. "Difficult," he offered. "That's the polite version of what they think," she said. "The people who call directness difficult are usually people who'd prefer you to be quiet for their convenience," he said. "That's their problem, not yours." She looked at him fully then, turning in the saddle so that consequential adjusted without comment beneath her. Cornelius was looking forward at the trail, easy in the saddle, his hat angled against the morning sun, and he said it so simply and without decoration that it took a moment for the weight of it to arrive. No one had ever said that to her before. Not quite like that. Not as a plain statement of fact rather than a consolation. She turned back to the trail and didn't say anything for a while, because she was not sure yet what she wanted to say, and she had the sense that with Cornelius Keller, there was no need to fill silence with words that weren't ready yet. October came in with its particular New Mexico clarity, the light sharp and the nights cold now, and the days still warm enough in the afternoon that the contrast could fool you into thinking you were somewhere easier than you were. The aspen on the higher canyon walls had gone yellow, and in the morning's Dust Creek smelled of cold stone and wood smoke from the houses where people had started their stoves again. Jennie and Cornelius had developed something that neither of them had named, but that both of them recognized. They took Sunday afternoon rides now, which had begun as practical excursions to check on the territory between town and the various homesteads she supplied, and which had evolved into something else entirely, without ever having a moment where the shift occurred. They ate supper together at Mrs. Cathcart's table on the evenings when Mrs. Cathcart cooked for her boarders, and on the evenings when she didn't they sometimes cooked over Jennie's small outdoor fire behind the lean-to. Simple things, bacon and hard bread, and whatever was in season. He told her about Pennsylvania, about his father's furniture shop in Pittsburgh, and the smell of fresh wood shavings, and the sound of his father singing while he worked. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and how the shop had grown quieter after, and how he'd left at 17 to go west, and how he'd never entirely lost the habit of looking for the next place, though he was beginning to wonder what it would feel like to stop looking. She told him about her father's smithy in Missouri, about learning to read the fire, and the metal the way other girls learned to read words on a page, about the particular pride of making something that worked and would keep working. She told him about the debt that had followed her father's death, how she'd sold almost everything to settle it, and how she'd felt stripped down to essentially herself, and had discovered that essentially herself was, against expectation, enough. She did not tell him everything. There were corners she kept. He seemed to understand this without needing to be told, which was one of the things she had come to trust about him. One Sunday afternoon in mid-October they rode north of town and climbed to a shelf of red rock above the canyon that looked out over a sweep of country so large it made the disagreements of Dust Creek seem very small. The horses were tired from the climb and grazed contentedly while Jennie and Cornelius sat on the rock face and looked out over the world. "Deerfield's drive leaves in 4 days," she said. He had been looking at the horizon. He turned to look at her. "Yes," he said. "You'll be gone, 3 weeks? Probably closer to 4, he said. "Depends on the weather." There was a pause. The wind moved across the rock, dry and tasting of distance. "When you come back," she started and then stopped. "When I come back," he said, and his voice was quiet and careful in the way it was when he was paying close attention. She looked out at the canyon walls going gold in the afternoon light. She was not by nature a woman who found it easy to say things that made her vulnerable. She had spent years making herself into someone who didn't need to. "When you come back," she said, "I'd like things to be as they've been, the evenings, the suppers, the Sundays." He was quiet for a long moment. "Then when I come back," he said, "I'd like things to be more than they've been." She looked at him. His gray eyes were steady and honest, and they held no pretense at all, and she found suddenly that she did not want to be careful. "More how?" she asked. "More in the direction of permanence," he said. "If that's something you'd consider." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that a lesser man might have filled the silence with retreat, with qualification, with the defensive humor men use when they've offered something and aren't sure it will be received. Cornelius Keller sat in the silence with her as though silence was simply another kind of conversation. "Ask me properly when you come back," she said finally. Something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite something else. It was in that warm country between them. "I will," he said. They rode back in the falling afternoon light, and the horses picked their way down the canyon path with careful feet, and Jennie's chest felt at once lighter and fuller than it had in as long as she could remember. The 4 days between that Sunday and Cornelius's departure were ordinary ones, which is to say they were full of the small, real commerce of a working life: horses to shoe, tools to mend, Bright's continued campaign of whispered discreditation to manage as best she could. But underneath the ordinary days there was something new running, a warmth that she did not yet know what to call, but that she was not inclined to question. On the morning the Deerfield drive left, Cornelius came to the smithy before dawn. He'd already saddled Fletcher, and the horse stood at the water trough looking philosophical about the early hour. Cornelius stood at the edge of the linta where Jennie was already working, because she had found that hard work in the early mornings was the best way she knew to manage feelings she wasn't ready to examine too closely. He did not say very much. He said he'd be back in 4 weeks at the outside. He said he'd written his name and Mrs. Cathcart's address in the small notebook she'd mentioned she kept customer accounts in, so she'd have it in front of her if she needed it. Then he said quietly, "If Bright escalates while I'm gone, don't face it alone. Deerfield's a fair man and he has neighbors who respect him. Go to them if you need to." "I'm not in the habit of asking for help," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to consider making an exception just for the next 4 weeks. She looked at him in the thin pre-dawn light. "You worry about me," she said, and she meant it as an observation, but it came out as something softer. "I do," he said. No equivocation, no apology for it. She reached out and briefly, firmly pressed her hand over his where it rested on the edge of the linta wall. Just a moment, just enough. 4 weeks, she said. 4 weeks, he said, and then he went, and she stood in the doorway of her lean-to and watched him ride south until the dark swallowed the shape of him and the sound of hoofbeats thinned to nothing. She went back to her forge and worked very hard for the rest of the morning. The 3 weeks that followed were the most difficult of Jennie's time in Dusk Creek, not because of any single event, but because of the grinding accumulation of Silas Bright's interference now that she no longer had the quiet, stabilizing presence of Cornelius Keller in the evening, or at the supper table, or appearing at the edge of her workspace with some small, useful observation about the world. Bright made his move in the second week. He sent a man to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. She found out about it later with a claim that her Lenta smithy was constructed on land adjacent to the Double B's official holdings, and that she was operating without proper authorization. It was not a strong claim, because the lean-to's land belonged to the livery operator, a steady man named Augusto Reyes who had a proper deed and the receipts to prove it. But Silas Bright had the money to make a weak claim complicated, and making it complicated was often as effective as winning it. Reyes came to Jennie with the official-looking letter he'd received, turning it in his hands with the anxiety of a man who has always operated within the law and is not sure what to do when the law is being used against him. "I am not moving my smithy," Jennie said, reading the letter. "I do not want you to move," Reyes said. "But the fee to respond to this officially is $30, and I am not sure I will pay the $30, Jennie said immediately, because she had that much set back and she had anticipated that something like this was coming. Reyes looked relieved and then guilty about his relief. "You should not have to pay it," he said. "No," she agreed. "I will, because the alternative is letting him win without a fight, and I'm not inclined to do that." She sent the $30 south with the next mail rider and wrote a letter to accompany Reyes's formal response, laying out the facts of her situation in plain language. She wrote it in the evenings by lamplight, and she wrote it carefully, because she understood that the pen and the proper document were tools just as surely as the hammer and the iron rod. In the third week, she took Cornelius's advice. She rode out to see a neighboring rancher named Hector Deerfield, who was the father of the Thomas Deerfield whose drive Cornelius had gone on, and she explained her situation clearly and without drama. Hector Deerfield was a 70-year-old man with a strong sense of fairness and a particular dislike for Silas Bright that dated back 15 years and had its origins in a water rights dispute. He listened to her with full attention, and then he went to his secretary and wrote a letter on his own letterhead to the Territorial Land Office, stating that Jennie Slater's smithy work had been valuable to every small rancher in the area and that frivolous claims against her property were an abuse of the territorial system. "My son speaks very highly of a young man named Keller who rode with his drive," old Hector said, as she was preparing to leave. "He says this Keller is a steady hand and an honest one." "He is," Jennie said, and she heard something in her own voice that made the old man smile with the particular gentleness of someone who has lived long enough to recognize what they're hearing. 4 weeks and 2 days after Cornelius left, she was working at the forge in the late afternoon when she heard Fletcher's distinctive way of walking, that deliberate, slightly flat-footed gait she'd come to know well from shoeing him on the street outside. She set down her hammer and walked to the edge of the lean-to, and there was Cornelius riding down the main street of Dusk Creek, dusty and travel-worn and looking thinner than when he'd left, and he turned his head and found her at the edge of her workspace as though he'd known exactly where she'd be. He rode over. He dismounted. He stood in front of her with the late afternoon sun behind him, and he looked at her for a moment in the way he had of looking at things that mattered. "You're 2 days late," she said. "River crossing outside of Colfax took longer than expected," he said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "Bright has been making trouble. I handled it. I'll tell you everything at supper." He nodded once, and then he said, "Before supper, Cornelius," she started. "I said I'd ask you properly," he said. "I intend to do that." He was not nervous in the conventional sense. He was very still, the way he was when something mattered. "I'm not a man with a great deal to offer in material terms," he said. "I have money saved enough to buy in on a small property if the right thing came along. I have skills with wood and with cattle, and with the various tasks that come with making a life in a place. I intend to stop moving and I intend to stay here, in Dusk Creek or wherever you are, because I have not, in 9 years of traveling, found anyone who made me want to put down roots until I found you." He paused. "I am asking if you would consider marrying me, Jennie Slater." The light was doing extraordinary things across the canyon walls behind him, going copper and rose and gold all at once, and the town was doing its ordinary evening business around them. And Jennie looked at Cornelius Keller's honest, quiet, steady face, and felt something in her chest settle into a place it had never quite reached before. "I will consider it," she said, and then, because she had never been a woman who took the long way when the short way was honest, "I have been considering it for some time. The answer is yes." He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, not the almost smile or the near smile, but the full version, and it changed his face in a way that reached his gray eyes and made them, for a moment, entirely unguarded. She thought she would not easily forget what that looked like. He reached out and took her hand, her blacksmith's hand with its calluses and strength, and he held it the way people hold things they're glad to have. "Now," she said, "you need to water your horse and then I'll tell you about Bright's land claim." "Of course," he said, still smiling. They told Mrs. Cathcart that same evening, and the boarding-house widow produced a bottle of something she'd been keeping for a special occasion with such immediate enthusiasm that it was clear she had seen this coming for considerably longer than either of them. Telling the rest of the town was both easier and more complicated. The people of Dusk Creek were not, as a community, opposed to the match. Cornelius Keller had made himself genuinely useful and genuinely liked in the months he'd been in town, and most people had a grudging respect for Jennie Slater even if they found her temperament challenging. Several of the homesteaders who'd watched Jennie stand up to Bright and hold her ground expressed something close to joy when the news spread. Silas Bright's reaction was what Jennie had anticipated: contemptuous dismissal. He was heard at the Copper Nail saying that a passing cowboy marrying a female blacksmith was the most sensible match either of them could hope for, which was meant as an insult, and which Jennie and Cornelius received as a fair description of two practical people who'd made a sensible choice. The land claim was resolved within the month. Hector Deerfield's letter, combined with the formal response from Ray's, was enough to have it dismissed as without merit. Bright grumbled. He would always grumble. But Jennie had learned that Silas Bright was most threatening to people who stood alone, and she was not standing alone anymore. They were married on the second Sunday of November, 1878, in the small church whose pews Cornelius had helped repair. The preacher was a new one. The congregation had acquired a third since Jennie's arrival, and he was a young man named Fellows who was still genuinely enthusiastic about the territory and had not yet developed the hollow-eyed resignation of his predecessors. He married them in front of a congregation that included Mrs. Cathcart and Augusto Ray's and the Deerfield family, and a scattering of homesteaders and a few townspeople who had come partly out of genuine warmth, and partly because weddings in small towns are events and everyone wants to have been there. Jennie wore a dark blue dress that she had ordered from Santa Fe, and that had arrived exactly 3 days before the wedding, which she took as a sign that the universe had opinions about the timing. Cornelius wore his good coat and a clean shirt, and had gotten his hair cut the day before, and he stood at the front of the church with the composure of a man who is entirely sure of what he's doing and entirely happy about it. When the preacher said the words and she said yes and Cornelius said yes, she felt not the giddy vertigo of romance's beginning but something steadier and, she thought, better, the particular solidity of arriving somewhere right. They took the lean-to room that adjoined the smithy that night and the boarding-house rooms they'd each maintained for the weeks before, and began the work of making a shared life, which is a different kind of work than either of them had done before and considerably more interesting. That winter was a hard one in the territory. January of 1879 brought snow that was unusual even by the standards of the high desert. 3 separate storms that swept down from the north and turned the red scrubland white and made travel difficult and sometimes impossible. The canyon walls above Dust Creek held the snow in their red crevices and turned peculiar shades of rose and gray in the pale winter light, and Jennie found that she had more time than usual, the cold keeping all but the most essential horseshoeing work indoors. She used the time to plan. She and Cornelius had been talking since before they'd married about the possibility of expanding the smithy, adding proper walls, a second forge, maybe a section for Cornelius to do woodwork and carpentry in the same space. The territory was growing, and growing territories needed people who could make and fix things, and between her metalwork and his woodworking she had calculated carefully, a fairly comprehensive range of useful skills. The money was the question. Cornelius's savings from the cattle drive work, combined with what she'd managed to set aside, was enough for materials but not for labor, which meant they would be doing the building themselves, which was fine with both of them. They drew plans on the back of old order forms by lamplight, arguing productively about the best placement of the second forge and the most efficient use of the available floor space. "The woodwork bench should be against the north wall," she said, one evening in February. "The light is better in the morning and you do your most detailed work in the mornings." He considered this. "You've noticed what time I do my detailed work." "I notice things," she said. He smiled. "The second forge," he said, redirecting, "should be closer to the door, not further from it. The draw will be better." "You don't know the draw here," she said. "The wind comes from the east in the afternoons." "Since when?" "Since I've been here for 2 years," she said. He conceded this with the good grace of a man who has learned when someone knows more than he does and doesn't find this diminishing. It was one of the things she had come to love about him, his freedom from the particular pride that makes men unable to admit a superior knowledge without feeling reduced by it. They broke ground on the expansion in March, when the last of the winter had released its grip enough to make building possible. Cornelius proved to be exactly as skilled with wood as he had implied, and watching him work was something that Jennie found quietly astonishing. Not the same kind of work as hers, not the heat and the impact and the transformation of hard material, but something more patient, more coaxing, the way you'd work with something that has its own nature you need to cooperate with. They built together through the spring, and the building was its own kind of courtship, the daily negotiation of shared purpose, the learning of each other's working rhythms, the small irritations that came with close quarters and long days, and the satisfaction of having those irritations mean nothing beside the fact of a good thing being built. By May, the expanded smithy was finished, and it was a fine thing. Solid timber frame, 2 forges, a workshop space for Cornelius's carpentry that already had 3 orders pending from people in town, and a small office corner with a proper desk where Jennie could keep her accounts. They stood in the new space one evening after the last of the fitting out was done, and the lamplight moved across the fresh wood and the clean iron of the new fixtures, and it smelled of both of them, coal and smoke and fresh-cut pine, and Jennie felt something she recognized as pride, the particular kind that comes from making something real. "It's good," she said. "It's very good," he agreed. Silas Bright was not done with them, not entirely, but his campaign had become something smaller now, reduced from active opposition to the occasional grumbled slight at the copper nail. The land claim had failed. The whisper campaign had largely dissipated as Cornelius's presence gave people who'd been neutral a reason to come back. The business had not collapsed as Bright had apparently expected it to, and in fact it had grown, because word of the expanded smithy had reached homesteaders and small ranchers who'd been coming less frequently, and the new carpentry work Cornelius was doing was filling the gaps left by the ongoing uncertainty of the cattle market. In the summer of 1879, 2 things happened that altered the landscape of Dust Creek considerably. The first was that Sheriff Purdy retired. It had been coming for some time. The man was 63, and his knees had been making his intentions known. But the timing surprised people. His replacement was a younger man named Holt, brought down from the Northern Territory, who arrived in Dust Creek with a direct manner and a genuine interest in actually doing his job. Within his first 6 weeks, he had settled 2 long-standing disputes that Purdy had ignored, established a clear relationship with the nearest federal marshal's office, and made it comprehensively clear to Silas Bright, in one direct and documented conversation, that the sheriff's office in Dust Creek was no longer an extension of the Double B's business interests. Silas Bright was furious, then sullen, then, gradually, quieter. The second thing was that Jennie discovered she was expecting. She told Cornelius on a warm July evening, sitting on the new steps they'd built on the south side of the expanded smithy, with the last of the day's heat rising from the stone of the canyon walls, and the canyon itself going all those impossible colors. She told him simply and directly, because she did not know another way to say important things. He did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at the canyon, and she watched his profile in the fading light, watched the stillness that came over him when something was settling in him. Then he turned to her, and his face was, she searched for the right word later and could only find open. He looked open, the way a door looks when it's been swung wide onto something good. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I'm very well," she said. "And how are you feeling about it?" She had expected congratulations or excitement or any number of things that weren't that particular question. She felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with difficulty. She started and had to stop. "I'm more glad than I expected to be," she said. "I hadn't thought much about it in general terms, children in my life, and now I find I can't imagine." She stopped again. "I'm glad," she said simply, "very glad." He took her hand. They sat for a while in the canyon light without needing to say anything else, and the stars arrived one by one above the dark edge of the rock. Dust Creek did not have a doctor. The nearest physician was in Las Vegas, New Mexico, some miles away, and Jennie was not, by nature, a woman who spent a great deal of time in medical consultations when she felt healthy. But Mrs. Cathcart had delivered 4 of her own children and attended the deliveries of approximately a dozen others, and she was, by common consensus, the closest thing Dust Creek had to reliable obstetric knowledge. And she took charge of Jennie's pregnancy with the focused energy of a woman who has found her purpose. Jennie continued working at the forge well into the autumn, modifying how she worked rather than stopping, and she continued keeping the accounts and managing the increasingly busy operation of the expanded smithy. Cornelius watched this with a combination of pride and a quiet concern that he expressed not by restricting her but by being available, carrying the heavier materials, taking on the work that required the most sustained physical effort, making sure supper happened, and that there was firewood stacked, and that the details of daily life did not fall away. He was, she thought, watching him cross the yard one October morning with an armload of iron stock that she'd asked him to move, very good at love. Not love as performance, not the grand declaration and the dramatic gesture, love as attention. Love as the daily adjustment of everything he did toward her well-being without ever making her feel managed or diminished. She had not known before that love could be like this. She had seen love in her parents' house, which had been a rougher, more exhausted thing, good, but worn by difficulty and poverty and the constant press of survival. She had seen love in the town around her, which was often transactional or possessive or both. She had not seen what she had now. Love as partnership, love as the practical expression of the fact that someone else's flourishing matters to you as much as your own. She told him this one evening. She said it plainly because she was not, despite having guarded herself for many years, a woman who could sustain emotional dishonesty once she had decided that honesty was safe. He looked at her steadily. "I have been trying to be worth it," he said. "You are," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." He kissed her then, in the way he had of doing things that mattered without hurry, with his full attention on it, as though it was the only thing happening in the world. Their son was born on a cold morning in late January of 1880, in the back room of the expanded smithy that they'd made into their living quarters the previous summer. He was born with Cornelius's gray eyes and Jennie's straight, determined expression, and a set of lungs that announced his arrival to approximately half of Dusk Creek without any effort on anyone's part. Mrs. Cathcart was there, efficient and calm, and she placed the child in Jennie's arms and stepped back and looked at both of them with the soft satisfaction of someone who has helped something good into the world. Cornelius held his son for the first time with the care he gave to things that were both precious and real, and Jennie watched his face and saw that open look again, the one she had come to treasure. "He needs a name," she said. "He does," Cornelius said. "I was thinking if you'd agree my father's name was William." "William Keller," Jennie said, tasting it. "William. What do you think?" "I think it's a good name," she said. "Solid, worth growing into." They named him William James Keller, the James being her father's name, and he was, in the opinion of essentially everyone in Dusk Creek who met him in his first weeks, an extremely fine baby. Even Holt, the sheriff, who had ridden by on a courtesy call when word spread about the birth, peered into the room, nodded once with the gravity of a man acknowledging an important civic event, and said that the boy had the look of someone who'd do something worthwhile. The spring of 1880 was a good one. The cattle market had steadied after 2 difficult years, and the homesteaders around Dusk Creek were doing better than they'd done in some time, which meant they were buying more materials and ordering more repairs, and generally moving more money through the local economy. Jennie's smithy, she had kept the name Slater and Keller Smithworks, which was practical and accurate, was the busiest it had ever been. Cornelius's carpentry work had its own reputation now, and he had 3 large furniture orders on the books along with the ongoing maintenance work for the church and 2 of the larger homesteads. Silas Bright was a reduced presence in their lives. His land claim had failed, his reputation for fair dealing had declined with the arrival of Sheriff Holt, and several of his ranch hands had quietly found employment elsewhere, including with the Deerfield operation, which Thomas Deerfield had taken over from his father and was expanding carefully and well. Bright still owned his land and his cattle and his grievances, but he held them at a distance from Jennie and Cornelius now, and that distance was sufficient. The town itself was changing. New families had come in, a doctor had finally arrived and opened a practice above the general store. A school had been started in a building on the east end of town that was too small immediately upon opening, and needed to be enlarged before its first year was out. Dusk Creek was becoming the kind of town it had been trying to become for some time, a real place rather than an outpost, and Jennie and Cornelius were part of the grain of it, woven in. On an evening in late May, William asleep in his cradle inside, and the smell of the spring night coming through the open-door sage and night-blooming things and the cold, sweet smell of the canyon, Jennie and Cornelius sat on their south steps in the dark and talked, as they often did, about everything and nothing. "Do you remember," she said, "the morning I raised my voice at Silas Bright, when he tried to short me on the shoeing?" "I remember it," he said. "Everyone stepped back," she said. "Everyone in the whole street. Every man just moved away from it." "I remember," he said. "You didn't," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see his profile against the slightly lighter dark of the canyon sky. "No," he said. "Why?" she asked. She had wondered this. She had never asked directly. He thought about it in the way he thought about things. "Because you were right," he said, "and because there was nothing frightening about a person who was right and said so clearly." A pause, and because he stopped. "Because," she prompted. "Because I looked at you," he said, "and I thought that here was someone who was exactly what they appeared to be. Not performing, not managing, just there, fully there." He turned to look at her. "I have spent a great deal of my life around people who weren't fully there, who were somewhere else in their heads while their bodies went through the motions. You were entirely present in that moment, even angry, maybe especially angry, and I found I couldn't move away from it." She looked at him in the dark. "The stars were extraordinary tonight, the kind of sky you only got out here, away from cities, away from eastern lights so dense and bright overhead that looking up felt like looking into something rather than away from something. I've never raised my voice at you," she said. "Not in all this time." "No," he said. "I wonder sometimes if I have it in me anymore," she said. "To be that angry at someone. You'd find it if you needed it," he said, "but you haven't needed it with me." "No," she said, "I haven't." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her in the easy, settled way of people who have been touching each other long enough that it has become as natural as breathing. "I think," she said quietly, "that I haven't needed to raise my voice at you because you actually listen. Not just hearing the words, but actually listening," he said. "Yes." "It's rarer than it should be," she said. "It is," he agreed. They sat in the warm dark for a long time, listening to the canyon silence, which was not really silence at all but the particular sound of a wild country at rest, the distant cry of some night creature, the movement of air through rock, the faint shifting of the horses in the livery down the street. Inside, William made a small sound in his sleep and was quiet again. The summer of 1880 brought a visitor to Dust Creek that neither Jennie nor Cornelius had anticipated. Cornelius's older brother, a man named Robert Keller, who appeared one morning in July on the stage from Santa Fe. Robert was 32, a businessman who had done well in Pittsburgh and had apparently decided, for reasons he explained at some length and which boiled down to a kind of restlessness, to see what his younger brother had made of himself in the West. He was nothing like Cornelius. Where Cornelius was quiet, Robert was expansive. Where Cornelius listened, Robert filled space with words. He was not unkind. He was in fact quite cheerful and generous and full of opinions. But he was the kind of man who found silence suspicious, and who therefore worked constantly to prevent it. Jennie liked him more than she'd expected to, which she discovered approximately 1 hour into his first evening with them, when he said something about Pennsylvania politics with such exasperated accuracy that she laughed out loud, and he looked at her with genuine delight and said, "Cornelius told me in his letter that you don't suffer foolishness, but he didn't mention you were funny." "I'm not generally funny," she said. "You're an easy audience." "I'm an excellent audience," he said agreeably. "I always have been." Cornelius watched this exchange with the particular quiet pleasure of a man watching two people he loves getting on well. Robert stayed for 3 weeks. He took his meals with them, entertained young William with a patience that surprised everyone including Robert, and spent his days walking the territory with the fascinated eyes of someone for whom this landscape was entirely foreign and therefore entirely interesting. He had questions about everything: the geology of the canyon walls, the economics of the cattle trade, the legal structure of the territory, the daily realities of the smithy work. And he asked them with a directness that Jennie found she respected even when she was slightly exhausted by the volume of questions. On his last evening, after William was asleep and the three of them were sitting with coffee outside in the warm night, Robert said, "I expected to come out here and find Cornelius living on dust and optimism. I did not expect," he gestured at the solid, well-built expanded smithy, the clean yard, the ordered domestic evidence of a life built carefully and well, this. "What did you expect?" Jennie asked. "Something more provisional," Robert said, "more temporary." Cornelius always moved growing up, never settled. "Our father used to worry." He glanced at his brother. "I used to worry." "I found the right place," Cornelius said simply. Robert looked at Jennie and then at his brother with an expression of someone who is choosing not to say the obvious thing because it doesn't need saying. "You did," he said. When Robert's stage left the following morning, he shook Cornelius's hand and then, unexpectedly, turned to Jennie and shook her hand too, with the formal warmth of someone offering genuine respect. "You have made a good life," he said. "Both of you. Come to Pittsburgh someday. I'd like to return the hospitality." "Someday," Jennie said, and meant it as a real possibility rather than a polite deflection. They watched the stage pull away in a cloud of red dust, and Cornelius stood beside her with his hands in his pockets and the morning sun doing complicated things to the shadows on the street. "You liked him," Cornelius said. "He talks too much," she said. "But yes." "He liked you considerably," Cornelius said. "He told me last night that I had somehow managed to marry someone who was both his favorite kind of person, direct to the point of rudeness, and apparently, for reasons he could not entirely account for, wonderful. He was slightly irritated by this." She looked at him sideways. "Direct to the point of rudeness," she said. "He meant it as a compliment," Cornelius said. "I know he did," she said. "I took it as one." Autumn came again, the second autumn of their marriage, and it found them settled into their life the way people settle into good clothes, comfortably, with an ease that comes from time and use. William was growing with the focused determination of a healthy child, pulling himself upright on the legs of the furniture, examining everything within reach with the scientific intensity of someone who has recently realized the world is very large and very interesting. The smithy had its rhythm. The carpentry work had its rhythm. The evenings had their rhythm supper, then usually an hour of accounting or correspondence or planning at the desk, then the south steps if the weather allowed, which in New Mexico territory it often still did even into October, talking or quiet according to what the evening called for. One October evening Jennie said over supper, "I would like a second horse." "For work?" Cornelius asked. "For Sundays," she said. "Consequential is not as young as he was, and I want a horse that can keep up with Fletcher when we ride north." He considered this. "There's a man near Mara who raises good quarter horses," he said. "Thomas Deerfield mentioned him. We could ride up there in the spring." "I want to go sooner," she said. "Before the winter." He looked at her. "Is this about the riding, or is this about getting out of town before the winter closes in?" She smiled. "Both." "All right," he said. "Next week if the weather holds." They rode to the Horseman near Mora in the third week of October, leaving William in Mrs. Cathcart's delighted care for 2 days, and they rode through country that had gone all its fall colors. The aspen yellow and the scrub oak red-brown, and the sky that particular deep October blue. They stayed the night at a small way-station inn and ate a supper that was unremarkable and slept in a room with a slightly crooked floor, and it was, somehow, one of the best nights Jennie could remember. Just the two of them in a creaky room with the sound of horses in the yard below, and Cornelius's warm steadiness beside her, and the sense of the whole wide territory around them, full of possibility. She came home with a young bay mare she named Deliberate, because she had been maintaining the naming convention, and the mare had a considered, careful way of moving that seemed to warrant it. Cornelius declared the name perfect. November brought the anniversary of their wedding, and Cornelius marked it by giving her a piece of furniture he'd been building in the back corner of the carpentry workshop for weeks. A writing desk of exceptional quality, dark walnut with brass fittings, with a folding top and 6 small drawers, and the kind of joinery that declared itself the work of someone who took wood seriously. He'd had it carried into the office corner of the smithy while she was occupied at the forge one morning, and she walked in at midday to find it waiting for her, and she stood in front of it for a long moment with her hand on the cool smoothness of the walnut top. "Cornelius," she said. "You mentioned," he said from the doorway, "some months ago that you wished you had more space for the correspondence, that the corner of the supper table wasn't sufficient." "I mentioned it once," she said. "I was listening," he said. She turned around and looked at him, and the thing she felt in her chest was large and complicated and entirely good. "Come here," she said, and he came, and she held him in the middle of the office corner of their smithy with her hands in his coat and her face against his neck, and she thought that there was nothing in the world like being known, and tended to by someone who did it not because they were required to, but because they actually wanted to. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was milder than the previous one, and it passed with the warm domestic quality of good winters. The smithy's forges keeping the building warm, William progressing through the steady accomplishments of a child becoming a person, the accounts healthy, the town around them doing its various things. Sheriff Holt had by now established a genuine peace in Dust Creek, not the performed peace of Purdy's tenure, but the real kind that comes when the law is actually respected. Silas Bright had, over the course of the past year, gradually redirected his energies toward a land sale negotiation with a railroad company that was reportedly considering a southern route through New Mexico territory. And this had consumed his attention enough that his interference in the local economy had diminished to nearly nothing. He was not a changed man, and Jennie did not credit him with any virtue he didn't possess, but his war with her specifically had ended, less with a peace treaty than with an exhaustion of his interest. One afternoon in February of 1881, Jennie walked past the Copper Nail and saw, through the window, Silas Bright at the bar, and he saw her at the same moment, and for a moment they simply looked at each other through the glass. Then he turned back to his drink and she walked on, and the silence of that exchange said everything there was to say, that his power to diminish her had reached its limit, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and that was sufficient. She told Cornelius about it that evening, and he listened in the way he had of listening, fully, with his eyes on her face, and when she finished he said, "How did it feel?" "Smaller than I expected," she said. He looked like what he is, a man who ran out of ways to be large. Spring came to Dust Creek with its particular western extravagance, the wildflowers in the scrubland, the red canyon walls losing their winter severity, the light lengthening, the world opening up again after the compressed intimacy of cold months. In March, Jennie realized she was expecting again, which she had half suspected and fully hoped for, and she told Cornelius with the same directness she'd told him the first time. He responded with the same open quality, the same first question, "Are you well?" and the same warmth in his eyes when she said she was very well and very glad. William received the news of an impending sibling with the philosophical incomprehension of a child who does not yet have the language to respond to abstractions, and then went back to investigating the properties of a piece of firewood. This pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others, as second ones often are, she had experience now, but her body was managing a busy smithy operation and a 1-year-old child simultaneously, and the autumn was a particularly demanding one for the business. But she had Cornelius, whose daily calibration of his support, never infantilizing, never restricting, always making the practical things slightly less difficult without making a production of it, meant that she arrived at November feeling tired but not depleted. Their daughter was born in December of 1881, early in the morning of the shortest day of the year, which Jennie noted afterward as being perfectly timed for a child who would, she suspected, have strong opinions about the quality of light. She was born with Jennie's dark hair and Cornelius's gray eyes, and she announced her presence with even greater force than William had managed, which was an achievement. "She has your voice," Cornelius said, when the baby had subsided into pink-faced peace in Jennie's arms and the room had gone quiet. "God help whoever tries to talk over her," Jennie said. They named her Clara Frances Keller Frances for Cornelius's mother, and she proved from her first weeks to be a child who took up exactly as much space as she felt she was entitled to, which was all of it. Mrs. Cathcart wept slightly when she saw her, which she claimed was because of the cold coming in through the door, and which no one believed. The summer of 1882 found Slater and Keller Smithworks in the strongest position it had yet been in. The expanded operation was fully running. Cornelius's carpentry had earned a reputation that brought occasional orders from as far as Santa Fe, and the town of Dust Creek had grown to the point where the school had been properly expanded. The doctor's practice had a small adjoining room for minor procedures, and a second general store had opened at the north end of town, which meant Harlow could no longer work his thumb-on-the-scale approach without losing business to the competition. which did something useful to his ethics. In July, a group of homesteaders who'd long been customers of Jennie's came to her with a proposal. They wanted to form a small cooperative purchasing arrangement for metal supplies, buying in larger volumes to reduce individual costs, and they wanted to ask if she would be willing to manage the ordering as part of her regular operation. It was the kind of arrangement that required trust, and the fact that they were coming to her with it, a woman, in a territory and era when such proposals were made to men, was not something she took for granted. She said yes, and she told Cornelius about it that evening, and he said with quiet satisfaction, "It's what you've earned." "It's what I've worked for," she said. "Both things," he said. She looked at him. "Both things," she agreed. There were, in the years that followed, the ordinary difficulties and extraordinary pleasures that make up a life built well in a hard country. There were difficult seasons for the business and excellent ones. There were years when the rains were good and the territory felt generous, and years when the drought came and the ground cracked and the cattle suffered and the men who depended on them suffered with them. There were political upheavals in the territory that sent ripples through the town, the continuing complications of land rights and water rights, and the rights of the indigenous peoples whose land all of this sat on, who had been displaced and dispossessed in ways that Jennie thought about more than most people in Dust Creek, and that she and Cornelius talked about in the evenings, seriously and without easy resolution, because there were no easy resolutions. Only the honesty of acknowledging that the land they stood on had a history that did not begin with their arrival. Cornelius built William a bed when he grew out of his cradle, and then a desk when he was old enough to use one, and then a proper bookshelf when it became clear that William Keller had his father's quiet nature and his mother's fierce intelligence, and that his primary interest was reading everything he could get his hands on. Clara, in the meantime, had decided that the smithy was her domain and spent as much time as she could near the forge, watching her mother work with the focused attention of someone learning and not bothering to hide it. "She's going to be a blacksmith," Cornelius said, watching Clara at age 5 direct a pretend forge operation with one of William's old toy hammers and a flat stone serving as an anvil. "Good," Jennie said. "She has your directness," he said. "She has yours too," Jennie said. "She listens." He smiled, the full smile she had first seen on the day he'd proposed, and that had never, in years of seeing it, lost any of its quality. "I suppose she does," he said. The years settled into their shape the way good years do, not without event, not without the textures of difficulty and joy and grief and celebration, but with the underlying steadiness of a life that has been built on honest ground. Dust Creek became, in the 1880s, genuinely what it had been reaching for, a real town in a real territory, with all the complications and rewards of community. Old Hector Deerfield died in 1883, which hit Cornelius and Jennie harder than they'd expected, because he had been kind to them in important moments and had asked for nothing in return except the courtesy of being taken seriously. They attended his funeral on a cold November morning and stood at the graveside, and Jennie held Clara, who was too young to understand death but old enough to know something serious was happening. And she thought about the invisible lattice of obligation and care and gratitude that holds communities together, and felt the weight of it, and was glad of it. Thomas Deerfield, who had inherited his father's fair nature along with his ranch, stopped by the smithy the following week and sat with them at the supper table and said, simply, "My father thought a great deal of you both." He said it to both of them, which mattered. In the autumn of 1884, William Keller, who was 4 years old and extremely interested in the horses at the livery, caused a brief crisis by somehow getting into the paddock and attempting to groom a young stallion he decided was his friend. The horse in question was not amenable. The crisis was resolved by Cornelius, who was faster across the yard than any reasonable person would have expected him to be, and who extracted his son from the situation with the calm precision of a man who assesses the actual situation rather than the potential one. William, sitting on the fence afterward, slightly disheveled and entirely unrepentant, looked up at his father and said, "He would have been my friend eventually." "He would have needed more time," Cornelius agreed gravely. "Next time I'll bring him something," William said. "Yes," Cornelius said. "That would be wise." Jennie, who had been watching from 20 feet away with her heart in her mouth, let out a breath that was also approximately an answer to everything. She looked at her husband, who met her eyes over their son's head. And in that look was every year of everything they'd built. All the evenings and the arguments about forge placement, and the drives to look at horses and the letters by lamplight, and the hard winters and the good springs and the children who were entirely themselves and entirely wonderful. And she thought that she had not imagined, when she rode west on a mule named Consequential with a leather saddlebag full of tools, that this was what waited. She had not imagined being known. She had not imagined being stayed with, through the voice raised and the anger shown and the walls kept and the walls eventually cautiously brought down. She had not imagined a man who did not step back from the full version of who she was. She had not raised her voice at him, not once in all these years. Not because she had made herself smaller or more manageable, not because she had suppressed or diminished anything, but because he had never, not once, given her a reason to. He had listened. He had been honest. He had asked her how she felt and meant the question. He had built her a desk because she'd mentioned wanting more space for correspondence. He had ridden with her to the Chalmers homestead, not because she couldn't go alone, but because 12 miles of scrubland in uncertain country warranted company. He had not treated her competence as something that needed managing or her directness as something that needed correcting. He had simply stayed, present fully, without stepping back from anything she was. She had never needed to raise her voice at him again. She walked to the fence where he stood and leaned against it beside him, and he shifted so that their shoulders were touching, the easy familiar weight of it, and William jumped down and ran toward the smithy calling for Clara about something, and the afternoon light was golden and long across the yard, and the canyon walls held it the way they held everything. The years, the weather, the accumulated weight of all that had happened here and all that would. "What are you thinking?" Cornelius asked, not because he needed to fill the silence, but because he was, as he had always been, genuinely curious about what was in her head. She considered the question with the seriousness it had always deserved from him. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I rode into this town with a mule and a saddlebag and an idea that being sufficient in myself was the best I could expect." She paused. "I'm thinking that I was wrong about that." He looked at her. "Wrong how?" "Being sufficient in yourself," she said, "is necessary but not complete. A person can be entirely sufficient and still be better with someone else in the picture." She turned to look at him. "You are that person in my picture. You have been for a long time and you will be for longer, and I wanted you to hear me say that directly." He held her gaze for a moment in that way he had, full and still and entirely present, and then he said, "You have been in every picture I have since about 30 seconds after I watched you make Sela's Bright pay full price for a horseshoeing." He said it with the same simplicity with which he said everything that mattered. "That's not likely to change." She laughed, which was a thing she had also come to do more than she used to, here in this life with this man. "Good," she said. In the spring of 1885, on a Sunday afternoon in April when the wildflowers were doing their extravagant best across the scrubland, and the canyon air tasted of warmth and growing things, Cornelius and Jennie rode north on Fletcher and Deliberate, just the two of them, to the shelf of red rock above the canyon where they'd sat on the afternoon he'd first suggested something permanent. They had made it a Sunday tradition, this ride, when the seasons allowed, though it had been some months since the winter had permitted it. They climbed in the companionable silence of people who know the route and each other and find both comfortable. The horses picked their way up the rocky trail with practiced ease. Deliberate had become everything Jennie had hoped, steady and sure-footed, and with the considered manner her name implied. At the top, they let the horses rest and graze and sat on the same shelf of stone, looking out over the same sweep of country they'd looked over all those years ago. The country was beautiful in the spring afternoon. The canyon walls rose and red, and the valley below them showing the first green of the season in the creek-lined vegetation, and the scrub newly leafed. Dust Creek was visible in miniature, its streets and buildings small and contained and familiar. From up here you could see the expanded smithy clearly, the addition Cornelius had built, the south-facing steps where they sat in the evenings. You could see the livery and the church and the school and the doctor's office and all the evidence of the town having made itself into what it had set out to be. 7 years, Jennie said. 7 years, he agreed. Are you happy? She asked. He turned to look at her with that look that had never changed, the one that was all attention and no pretense. Completely, he said. Are you? Yes, she said, simply and without reservation. More than I knew was possible. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had on the day she'd said yes to him. Her blacksmith's hand, calloused and strong, held in his with the ease of long familiarity. They sat for a long time on the red rock in the April afternoon, the canyon below them and the sky above them and the whole wide western world around them, full of difficulty and beauty, and the particular, irreducible richness of a life built deliberately in a hard place by two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and stayed. Below, in the town, a door opened, and 2 small figures emerged into the yard of the smithy. William, identifiable even at this distance by his deliberate, slightly bookish way of moving, and Clara, identifiable by the speed with which she crossed the yard directly toward whatever had caught her interest. They were watched over by Mrs. Cathcart, who had by now become family in every way that mattered, and who could be seen settling into a chair on the south steps with the comfortable authority of a woman who has earned her place. Jennie watched them, her children, her town, her life, and she felt something settle further into her, a final, deep settling, the kind you feel when you are exactly where you are supposed to be and you know it all the way down. We should go back soon, she said. Clara will have the younger Deerfield girl talked into something. She will, Cornelius agreed. She always does. She gets that from me, Jennie said. She gets it from both of us, he said. I just negotiate more quietly. She laughed again, and the sound of it went out across the canyon and dissipated into the wide air, and she stood and helped him gather the horses, and they rode back down the trail toward the town that was theirs, toward the life they had built with their own hands out of work and honesty and the courage to stay. And the evening came on around them golden and certain, and below them the lights were beginning to appear in the windows of Dust Creek, small and warm against the gathering dark, as steady and irreplaceable as any star.